Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. We have a ton of stuff to get through in today's video, so much in fact that it's being split into two videos. This video is going to focus on PC-related stuff, with a second video focusing on console, which is what Amy will be recording. But let's start things out with some AMD stuffs, as Team Red has an awful lot of stuff in the pipeline. The first of these discoveries is from Patrick on Twitter. I'll link, of course, to his Twitter account in the video description. And if you recall, we've actually seen several leaks for the Ryzen 4000 series. Ryzen 4000, naturally, is built on the Zen 3 architecture, and with it has a plethora of improvements, IPC being one, because of tweaks to architecture and so on, but also higher clock frequencies. Igor from Igor's lab, who is actually really quite trustworthy in general, he's had excellent information, I have to say, he said that he believed that the 4.9 GHz clock frequency we saw was for the 16-core model. As a very quick reminder, the core counts for the Ryzen 4000 will be identical to what we have now, so 8, 12, 16, and of course the lower end SKUs too. But according to Patrick, this is not correct. He believes instead that it's a 12-core processor. There is, however, another variant of this that we've seen, which had a lower clock frequency, which was only 4.6 GHz, but it's worth noting, of course, that these are engineering samples. So final clock frequencies could either be plus or minus this. Realistically, it will be at least this, but you never know. It's engineering samples, so anything can happen. Does this mean that 5 GHz is confirmed for 16 cores? Well, if we look at past history of AMD's processors, the 3950X had 100 MHz higher boost frequency, so it's 4.7 rather than 4.6, the 3900X of course being the 4.6. So it is possible that 5 GHz could be a thing for the 4950X. Also, you might be able to get that anyway if you start tweaking the CPU. It's possible that the Zen 3 architecture will be different in how we tweak and overclock versus the Zen 2 architecture, but that's outside the scope of this video. Bottom line is, the 5 GHz dream is not dead. I personally believe that it could happen. I believe that there's a likelihood that we could hit 5 GHz. And I think AMD will possibly want to do this for a marketing push. This is not confirmed. This is not me claiming that I'm hearing from sources that it could hit it. But just logically, if we look at what we're seeing from the engineering samples of the 12-core processors, historically, we look at what AMD have done in terms of clock frequencies of the older generation of Ryzen processors, and we think of it like those engineering samples. It's a massive PR thing. Like, realistically, if you're benchmarking, let's just say, you know, a 10900K, 99% of people, even if you knew that the clock frequency was at 4.9 gigahertz and another one's at 5.1 gigahertz, if you were doing a blind comparison, even if you're doing Cinebench runs and I blanked out everything else, 99% of people would not be able to tell the difference, let alone if you were doing, I don't know, tests in Doom Eternal or something like that. You know, like actual gaming tests. Like, no one really is going to know the difference between 200 megahertz on a 10900K, let alone something like 5 gigahertz. Now the question is, of course, would it even be able to sustain that with all of the cores under load? Quite frankly, it's possible that one of the things I did hear quite a while ago, and I covered this in a video, but goodness knows when, is that the Zen 3 architecture is supposedly better at maintaining higher clock frequencies with more processors under load. In other words, the frequency doesn't vary up and down quite so quickly. it's slightly more stable, but I don't know enough on what the person who told me that meant. Like, exactly, does that mean that it's less of a steep cutoff per core active? Does it mean that it doesn't downclock as much? Like, how, that doesn't even mean much. And B, is it even true? Regardless, I'm going to be really curious to see what Zen 3 brings to the table. I mean, I'm even seeing some people say that Zen 3 is so good that it makes Zen 2 basically obsolete. And I understand where the perspectives of that come from. Like, you know, the performance is so good, it just makes the previous generation look kind of bad. The thing is, when you start saying stuff like that, though, it also doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Just for example, let's say you've got, I don't know, like a 3700X, and you're pairing that with whatever GPU for gaming. It's not like suddenly the 3700X is become terrible, you know? And if you don't need an upgrade, that's fine, but the next generation is going to be super duper interesting. I'm also very curious how Intel will respond with Rocket Lake. Yes, I know Rocket Lake with the 14nm has become a slight meme, but if it hits the clock frequencies we're hearing, and does have a decent IPC gain, I think for gaming it's possible that Intel still could have the advantage. I don't think it's going to be that much, and you can argue that it doesn't really matter, especially if you're playing at higher resolutions anyway, but still, we can only wait for the benchmarks. One last final thing actually from Patrick, he also states that AMD are working on PCIe 5 support. That's not really anything surprising. We know that the industry is moving towards that, so I'm not going to spend any longer discussing that than what we've just said, because quite frankly, yeah, we all know that the industry is moving to PCIe 5. It's, you know, just inevitable. It's like the tides or something, you know, profound. But moving on to something kind of interesting for the 30 series from Nvidia. Yes, I know it's still dominating the news, but honestly, I am so excited about the next generation of cards from both AMD and Nvidia. One of the things that has been discovered, this is courtesy of Cyberpunk Cat, and that is the Zotac Firestorm and other cards from the 30 series have an insane clock frequency. So the first thing is that we have EVGA showing off a 3090 card. It's a For the Win 3, and it has a clock frequency of 2.1 gigahertz. It's an OC boost clock. Now, it is theoretically just a promotional image, but I think this is kind of setting a bar of where they obviously expect the cards to hit. If you look at the temperatures, they're not exactly chilly, but, I mean, yeah, the memory as well has been overclocked here. If this is true, if this is what we can get out of the cards for the 3090, that is insane. Again, I stress, this is for illustrative purposes, but it's probable, given the fact that they're advertising this and teasing with this, that this is roughly what you can expect from the cards. Meanwhile, Zotac with the 3080 is showing 1933 for its clock frequency. But that is not the focus of the 30 series news. Oh, by golly gosh, no it's not. We are going to now move over to the actual insanity that is the RTX 3090's 8K performance. Nvidia have actually detailed this now, and we actually have quite a lot of insight into how the 3090 will handle 8K. It is imperative to realize that some of these games are being run with DLSS enabled, because obviously the sheer number of pixels that we are looking at here dwarfs 4K. We're looking at 4 times the number of pixels over the 4K resolution. It's just it's ridiculous. And this is basically upsampling from obviously a lower resolution. But let's have a look at the game which is the most obvious first, and that's Control. This title is running, as you can see from the top there, hardware-based ray tracing enabled, and it scores a grand total of 8 frames a second without DLSS, but from upsampling it, it goes up to about 60 FPS. I would say that there's a good possibility with overclocking a custom card, you could probably hit 60, especially if, I mean, we don't know how high the ray tracing settings are here. You could, if you are a stickler for 60 FPS, you could probably just knock down the ray tracing or another setting a little, just a smidgen, and then obviously get that frame rate. But just, geez, 60 FPS at 8K DLSS is nuts. The other title that is a pretty obvious one for a just a sheer performance of this card is Wolfenstein. Again, DLSS is running here. The game is not as demanding as something like Control, but 26, so it's still not exactly playable without DLSS enabled, but 74 if you do have it. Other titles, I won't read out all of them here because, quite frankly, I'll just be here until Christmas. Destiny, interestingly, does hit 60 FPS, whereas other games such as World of Warcraft are at 73 FPS, World of Tanks, you know, you could pretty much run that on your toaster, 95 FPS, Forza, 78 FPS, and so on and so on. This is going to be a card where not everyone is going to be wanting to purchase it because obviously it's really expensive. I personally think that the 3070 is going to be a really popular GPU because of the sheer affordability of it. Yes, I know that $500 is not exactly a drop in the bucket. It's still quite a lot of money, but it's still on par / outperforming an RTX 2080 Ti. And furthermore, I think for a lot of people who are going to be upgrading, if you've had something like a GTX 1080, especially if you had one near launch, like, you can argue that the 1080 is one of the best cards ever produced in terms of the longevity of it. It's now starting to struggle at games running at 1440p, from my experience anyway, if you're cranking everything up to the max, especially if it's a more demanding game. But generally, it's pretty decent. The fact that it's got 8 gigs of RAM as well definitely has helped its longevity. I think if it only had 6, it would have probably been a lot more of a struggle. The fact that obviously you can fairly well overclock the card as well. I think Nvidia definitely bit themselves in the butt a little bit just with how good Pascal was. So I think from a lot of people who are, you know, considering an upgrade, going from like a 1080 to either the 3070 or, you know, even better, the 3080 makes an awful lot of sense. Again, the RTX 2080 and other cards, Nvidia did admit that they didn't hit the performance targets that perhaps a lot of gamers had expected, and they seem to be somewhat distancing themselves from that. They seem to be trying to come across the marketing message that we understand that we didn't hit the targets and the pricing you guys expected. Obviously, they're really proud of the technology like DLSS and ray tracing, which I think they should be. But I do believe that I think that the next generation of cards from both companies is going to be pretty nuts, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we actually have on the table. It's worth noting, though, that this, of course, is one of the functions of DLSS 2.1. With DLSS 2.1, it can also do things like upsample for virtual reality headsets, which I think is fantastic. Obviously, VR experiences require an awful lot of performance because you want as high frame rate as possible. And latency and low frame rates for VR are not exactly conducive to happy times. But the 3090 actually upscales things to 9 times. So it's massively increasing the upsampled resolution for 4K. And it basically means that a game like Death Stranding, at native, it seems, is hitting 30-ish FPS, which is kind of what you would expect from a console. But obviously, it's hitting 8K rather than, you know, a console resolution. But with upsampling to 8K, you're getting almost 80 FPS, which Again, DLSS, as we've discussed many times and shown many times, it's really impressive how good of technology it actually is. I believe that AMD will have some type of similar technology. I've gone over this recently in an AMD video, but I believe it's going to probably be kind of a combination of lower precision operations running on the CUs, a bit like Xbox, probably, and some enhancements to Radeon image sharpening as well. But last thing that I'd like to discuss for you today is perhaps, if this is true, going to be about the most popular card in Nvidia's next generation lineup, I assume, and that is the 3060. I cannot verify this information. It's from the website HKEPC, and they apparently originally found it from Slashleaks, but that website has now removed the article. And there's a very good possibility that this is fake, so I'm throwing it in here. Unfortunately, we don't have specifications of what the 3060 could be, but it looks really tiny. We'll get into the size in just a moment, but they do mention that, of course, it's got hardware-based RT cores, it's Ampere architecture, 6GB of memory, which is running at running with GDDR6. There is no mention at all of the specifications. We could guess what they are, certainly, but it would just be pure guesswork based upon previous information. And I want to keep this new and just focus on this because, again, this could be fake. What we do know is that we have seen leaks for the 3060. We've seen several of them previously leaked, and this is via the EEC. So we do know that Nvidia are working on this. It naturally makes sense that Nvidia are working on this anyway, because they always do. Nvidia have admitted that there will be other Ampere cards, and you can look at the size of it and say, well, that looks fake. Now, obviously, this is a render. This is not a photo of a real card. But remember what we know about the actual PCB of, let's say, the 3080. It's titchy, it's really small, with the majority of the space of the card being the actual cooler with the two fans. So, logically, if you're shrinking things down because A, it's going to require less power. So let's just say one 8-pin power connector. I say that with complete ignorance. We don't know how much power it's going to take. But let's just say it's around the 200-ish watt mark. Again, we're in ignorance. I don't know how much it will take, but let's just say that it has lesser requirement for VRMs and just MOSFETs, and power delivery can obviously be pulled back a lot. The amount of space on the GPU itself can also be shrunk because it doesn't need so many memory modules. It's not got such a wide bus. Furthermore, the actual chip itself is obviously smaller than what we have with, let's say, the 3080 or 90. So you can kind of say, well, if you throw all of those factors together, a card like this is not that ridiculous. It doesn't look that ridiculous. It doesn't look that impossible, given what we know about the 3080 or 90s PCB. I mean, if that PCB was the same size as a traditional card, let's say let's say the 3090 and, 3080 were the same as, let's say, the 2080 Ti or what have you, fine, I would be more skeptical. But yeah, this is not that silly to me. If this is a real card, and I do believe that this is a legitimate GPU which will come out, but whether these leaks are true or not, or this size, I think that this is going to be a super popular card with people who are building like small form factor systems. And I also feel it's going to be very popular too with folks who don't necessarily want to cough up like, several $100 on a card. I suspect that Nvidia will obviously want to charge, maybe the 300-ish mark. That's just a guess. What we do know is that obviously the big Nave is 80 compute units, and then we've got the smaller variant of that, which is 72, which is obviously based on 21, Nave 21. But then we know that there's obviously cards which are lower than that in the hierarchy. So a very good guess with the lower end cards is that probably we're looking at a GPU which has like 64, as AMD consistently seem to be producing those. It also works out very well with the RDNA 2 architecture. So there'll probably be like a 64 version. There'll probably also be a 56 variant, and then maybe they'll be smaller still. I suspect that AMD will also slowly fill out their lineup. As I mentioned in my recent exclusive, which I'll try to remember to link in the video description, I was told that the lower end cards for Navi are going to launch next year, with AMD focusing this year on the high-end SKUs, so it's going to be interesting to see the timings of all of these cards. But I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. The normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.